One of the things that baffle me about modern game developers these days is their desires on becoming more and more cinematic with their games. Say what you want about Overwatch and its desires in monitoring the toxicity of people in game clips, at least it has some competitive gameplay in it. The same thing cannot be said to a lot of narrative-driven games lately, like Uncharted or the reboot Tomb Raiders, which consists of nothing but set pieces after set pieces of generic third-person shooter mixed with platforming, treasure hunting, etc. I got a chance to replay Rise of the Tomb Raider, which I just noticed that people use a lot for benchmarks these days because Crysis is out there sleeping, I guess. While I enjoyed the cathartic and violent third-person shooting and combat that makes Lara Croft to be an absolutely vicious, brutal killer, the story was just too bland, too generic, and written like someone just came out of an Indiana Jones marathon. The only element that I liked is Lara Croft. She is less whiny and a hell of a lot angrier in this time. Being angry is better than being whiny, especially when being whiny is put side by side by hacking the insides of someone's head with either ice axes or survival knives. And that's just the narrative-driven games that have generic third-person shooting. We haven't even talked about the walking simulators like Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, which only rely on the storytelling and sacrificing its entire gameplay. It's not that these games are badly designed or poorly made. I think the technical details of a lot of these walking simulators are commendable. It's just that in a video game, when you spend a lot of time trying to look nice instead of playing well, you're gonna end up in a significantly shorter experience than even the shortest of Call of Duty campaigns out there. The point is, the risk of making your own game cinematic is going to be players treating your game as a movie instead of an actual video game. I mean, come on, it's already in the word. Cinema, as in a movie theater in which you watch movies on. But the thing is, there are some game industry insiders who see the failures of these narrative-driven single-player games as signs that players aren't interested in single-player games anymore. That's right, just because you don't really like the narrative games by Naughty Dog and you just watch the cutscene compilations on YouTube, that means that people aren't buying single-player games anymore. Let's conveniently forget all the single-player games from last year that are actually pretty damn good. If you're caught out with my videos as of late, you might recall a couple of articles and statements from either game developers, publishers, or journalists who are claiming that single-player games are dead or dying. So let's get into a couple of statements from the industry insiders regarding single-player content.
I don't think that it's dead per se, Loftus said about the market for exclusively single-player games. I do think the economics of taking a single-player game and telling a very high-fidelity multi-hour story get a little more complicated. Gamers want higher fidelity and they want higher resolution graphics.
Yeah, well, I think you're confusing gamers want higher resolution graphics to publishers want higher resolution graphics. I'm plowing through Breath of the Wild just fine and it has about as cartoonish of graphics as you can get. I think you have the issues of being out of touch with your audiences. Just because your boss says that gamers want higher resolution graphics doesn't mean that they do.
These economic considerations may possibly explain or at least contribute to the discussion about microtransactions in AAA games. It is rare today for high-profile games to not have microtransaction systems in place.
I think we should iron out what the definition of AAA means because a lot of Japanese AAA games publishers or developers like Nintendo, Capcom, or Square Enix haven't fell down into that pit. If we're just talking about Western AAA publishers, I guess that also explains why AAA performed so poorly last year. Destiny 2 was garbage, Mass Effect Andromeda was garbage, Battlefront 2 was garbage, and all of that regardless of their microtransactions or loot boxes or whatever anti-consumer controversy nonsense that they had at the time.
In Loftus' estimation, single-player-only games will exist forever, though it is possible that they may become less prevalent. I don't think that there is ever going to be a time where there aren't single-player story-based games, she said. I do love the idea of building a community around the experience of these games.
While I cannot deny the possibility of single-player games to be less prevalent in the future, that possibility is very minuscule if you consider the many factors available surrounding the prevalence of single-player and multiplayer games today. If you're going to make a sustainable, free-to-play multiplayer game with microtransactions, I'm sure you're gonna need to cover up server costs somehow. There are gonna be more and more people working just to manage the community, and Blizzard seems to be doing very well. They end up spending a lot more time banning people instead of making content for the game. No, seriously, check out my last video. Just take lessons from Blizzard. They're practically putting all the players in Battle Royale and giving them exploding head colors, except this time the winner also dies in the end anyway. So you'll either keep on playing to die or just jump off a cliff and make things quicker. And even if you're so persistent and keep on playing the game, Blizzard is going to ban your accounts even for the most ridiculous of reasons like, oh, I don't know, playing one character too much. So congratulations Blizzard for removing the toxicity of Overwatch. You're also reducing the player base into the point of RuneScape servers. I mean, I don't play Overwatch and the only thing that I enjoyed out of that game was the never-ending abundance of Yuri cosplays. The next argument comes from none other than the CFO of EA.
Over the last 5 or 6 years, visual games had shrunk in size, Jorgensen said. It was down to about 80 people, which is subscale in our business, and the game they were making was actually being supported by a team in Vancouver and a team in Montreal because of that subscale nature. And we were trying to build a game that really pushed gameplay to the next level, and as we kept reviewing the game, it continued to look like a style of gaming, a much more linear game that people don't like as much today as they did 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Well, that's actually not true. 5 years ago was 2013 and 10 years ago was 2008. Those are the early years of video games progressing into becoming more and more cinematic. Still, this doesn't mean that players aren't welcome with the idea of an Uncharted-style Star Wars games, especially when they hired Amy Hennig from the Uncharted fame. But EA had to close Visceral down because according to GameSpot, they're more focused in multiplayer titles, aka Battlefront 2. I wouldn't say that Battlefront 2 crushed EA to the point where everyone is homeless, but there's certainly a noticeable impact to the backlash. The CFO then proceeded to say that they're still gonna salvage what was left in the project, so there's still probably some hope left for that game. Hopefully the Uncharted-style Star Wars game eventually gets developed, although in the hands of EA, I highly doubt that. Speaking of Uncharted, the next one is Amy Hennig of all people, who gave her 2 cents on the single-player debacle, and she made a very interesting and brutally true point that should be shoved in every single game developer or publisher that tried to make their games more cinematic.
People ask for story-based games but aren't necessarily buying them, they just watch them.
This is absolutely correct. Make your games more and more cinematic, game developers. You're going to have players to enjoy it just like how they would enjoy a freaking cinema. Like I said so many times, be careful what you wish for because every wish has consequences. The thing is, this argument still doesn't mean that people aren't interested in single-player games. Just because people watch the games on YouTube doesn't mean that they're not going to buy the game. I'm not very sure of the rough estimate. I think it's a 50-50 because I've seen people who both buy the game after they watch Let's Plays and not buy the games after watching Let's Plays. I personally bought a lot more games after I watched them on YouTube rather than games that I haven't bought. I bought Persona 5 even after I watched all the cutscenes and I still clocked 160 plus hours of it. I bought Xenoblade Chronicles 2 after watching the first 2 hours of the game. I bought Rise of the Tomb Raider after watching all the cutscenes for $10 when it's on sale anyway. Actually, scratch that. Considering that I watch a lot of the holy trinity of YouTube Let's Players and considering that they mostly play horror games, I may have a lot more games that I didn't buy after watching Let's Plays, but that's because I just don't like horror games. Surprised that I got to Resident Evil 7 just fine, maybe because it wasn't as scary as I thought it was. The point is, people watching other people playing the games does not necessarily mean the loss of sales. If your games are designed in a way that every individual experience are going to be different and you can only get your own if you play the game, then of course people are going to buy it. If your games are designed so that it contains only the story and the gameplay consists of either a generic third-person shooting action or none at all, then of course people are going to enjoy it like a movie. You need a good selling point for the game, not make the game cinematic and be surprised when people enjoy it just like a cinema. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, let's carry on.
I think we're in an inflection point right now. Obviously what happened with our Star Wars project didn't come out of the blue. A lot of too dramatic articles were written about it, the depth of linear story games and all that kind of stuff, but look, there is a real problem. This line we've been running up for a lot of years, which is the rising cost of development and the desires or the demands even of players in terms of hours of gameplay, fidelity, production values, additional modes, all these things, those pressures end up very real internally. If it costs you, say, 100 million or more to make a game, how are you going to make that money back and making a profit?
By reducing the budget that you spent on making the game look pretty and instead spend more budget in making the game to actually be fun. But hey, if you're going to risk making a linear game anyway, spend more budget in the writing department at least. All of that prettiness and dank hair physics are going to be pointless if your game only consists of walking or characters who are insufferable.
And the $60 price point can't change, right? There's a lot of negative press around monetization, loot boxes, games as a service, etc. But these things are trending now with the industry, especially for larger publishers, as an answer to the problem of rising development costs. Budgets keep going up, the bar keeps getting raised, and it starts making less and less sense to make these games.
You know, I really hate it when game developers or publishers complain that the cost of making video games are getting too high when they spend too much budget and looking nice rather than playing well. How can a game like Hellblade achieve all of that cinematic glory from a middling budget and be sold to only $20 to $30 and still gain profit? How can so many other games in the past who have way fewer budgets than these big AAA titles sold so much better, plays much better, and in some cases even look nicer than the AAA counterparts?
There's also this trend now that as much as people protest and say, why are you canceling a linear story-based game? This is the kind of game we want. People aren't necessarily buying them, they're watching someone else play them online.
Let me make this very simple to all publishers or developers, and I'm going to remind them every single time they bring this up. If you design a game in a way that makes them to look more cinematic, you're going to have players to experience them like a cinema. Do you know why it's bad to spend too much budget on the visuals? Because gamers can just experience the pretty visuals on YouTube without the needs of buying your game. The reason why people buy video games is because there's actual gameplay in it. Make video games that make people go, oh my, I want to try that game out for myself right after they watch a video or the game on YouTube. Not make them say, oh well, I'd rather watch this game full or just read the synopsis somewhere. If YouTube or Twitch or any other video streaming websites that stream video games are such a threat to you, I think you are severely lacking in imagination about the kind of games you want to make. I think the reason why AAA game developers and or publishers are scared of making single-player games these days is because they constantly make games that people can enjoy just as well if they watch them on YouTube. I think AAA game developers or publishers should put a lot more effort in making video games that make people want to buy them or try them after they watch someone else play it. And if that's too much to ask, I'm going to go back to my JRPGs. And that girl from Someone Lessons is pretty hot. The article who hosted this interview doesn't help by validating her viewpoint with an even dumber point.
She does have a point there. As much as people clamor for single-player story-focused games, they don't seem to buy them as much. The featured image at the top of the article portrays what is perhaps one of the finest examples of this phenomenon. Arcane's Prey was an outstanding title in this category, and yet it sold poorly despite strong critical reception. Similar issues were faced by other titles such as Dishonored 2, also by Arcane incidentally, and Machine Games' Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus.
Nice cherry picking that you got in there, article. Prey, while being an excellent game from what I've heard, has a horrendous marketing campaign. Dishonored 2 has a pretty buggy launch on the PC version and didn't improve that much in the story aspects. And Wolfenstein 2 was a garbage sequel. Why do you pick examples from these specific story-rich single-player games? In fact, why did you pick Dishonored 2, a game that was released 2 years ago? Last year alone, we have Persona 5 that sold millions, Divinity Original Sin 2 also sold millions, Hellblade sold 500,000 copies in just 3 months, even Doki Doki Literature Club was downloaded 1 million times. Actually, scratch that, 2 million times. Keep slamming that horrendously cherry-picked examples all you want, and I can give you 5 more examples that disprove your point.
It's hard not to link Henning's words with Remedy's recent statement on the problem of AAA single-player games development. The Finnish developer clearly stated they will add cooperative multiplayer to increase replayability, and they're not the only ones abandoning the single-player-only label.
If you guys don't know, Remedy is the developer of Max Payne, one of my favorite games of all time, which is a highly entertaining, high-octane, bullet-time shooter combined with great film noir and story. They also developed Alan Wake, a single-player game that is cinematic and episodic, but with a story that is not as good as Max Payne. If those two things are a bit too old for your memory, they also developed Quantum Break, which is literally a TV series that is incorporated into a game. Interviewing Remedy about the difficulties of making profit out of single-player games is like interviewing a rock star who slammed his guitar in every concert on how guitars are getting harder and harder to get. Remedy, adding co-op and multiplayer will not fix your games. Your single-player games are just not very good, especially when one of them is literally a TV series.
While CD Projekt Red reassured fans that there will be a fully fledged story campaign in Cyberpunk 2077, we note that the highly awaited role-playing game will also feature multiplayer elements, unlike the Witcher trilogy.
This one is pretty confusing because CD Projekt Red is not really the sorts of people who are into multiplayer. I checked every source available about whether or not Cyberpunk will have multiplayer. I went to Wikipedia, checked the citation that proved the claim, and the best possible statement that I can find to prove this is that it's going to have multiplayer features. Looking at other sources, this multiplayer feature could be some form of a social hub that will bridge between the multiplayer and single-player modes. I guess that confirms that there actually is a multiplayer mode in the game, it's just that Wikipedia needs to clarify the citations a bit. And even if CD Projekt Red blatantly stated that there will be multiplayer modes in their games, they also said that multiplayer will not have microtransactions, you're gonna get what you paid for, and we're gonna leave greed to others. So they're not gonna seek profit off of the multiplayer of this game. The single player is where the game is at and the reason why people will buy the game. So making a point that CD Projekt Red is also moving into multiplayer to gain profit is horrendously suicidal because Cyberpunk 2077 is primarily a single player game. Why are you even making this point? It's so freaking stupid. Overall, the arguments of the dead or dying of interest towards story-based single-player games are riddled with so many misinformation. It ranged from the misunderstanding of the audiences, the refusal to admit the faults of poorly managed budget, which results in the needs of more and more microtransactions or higher pricing, cherry-picking bad examples of single-player games that sold poorly while ignoring other single-player games that sold well, and of course the desires of making games to be more and more cinematic without even thinking about the consequences, like players enjoying them just like a cinema. I've said this so many times in the video, and I guess I need to repeat this ad nauseum so that this message can get through your heads. Be careful what you wish for. Every wish has consequences, and what you wish for might not really be what you really wanted.